I want to talk for a few minutes about some subsets of folk tales. The first one are what are called fables. And so when we think about fables, we generally think about Aesop's fables. Aesop was a Greek slave around 600 BC, and he popularized stories that were already in existence. So he took stories that were already out there and wrote them down. His fables were written in prose, which means they were written in sentences and paragraphs, as opposed to poetry. The Aesop's fables are the ones that most of us read in school. But there are two other sources of fables that we see in literature quite often. One source is India. The fables that we have from India were originally used to educate future kings and rulers, and because of that, they tend to be very preachy, or another word for that is didactic. The fables that we have from India are also written in prose or paragraph form. And the final source is a Frenchman named La Fontaine. La Fontaine's fables, they were written in poetic form. So when we think about fables, they have three parts. They have generally no more than three characters, and those characters are going to represent qualities of our personality. The second part of the fable is that there's going to be an action to illustrate the point. And the third part of a fable is that there's going to be an implied or stated moral. The trend today is to read a fable to students and then ask them to infer what the moral is. A word that I'd like you to know, I'm going to see if I can write it up here at the top, is the word, let's see, word fabulist. A fabulist is someone who writes a fable. And so another trend these days is to expose kids to lots of fables, read lots of fables to them, and then let them try their hand at writing a fable. And then they can become a fabulist. Okay? Another subset of folk tales is what we call a myth. So when we think about myths, many of us turn naturally to Greek mythology. So the Greek mythology, they were collected in poetic form by somebody named Hesiod in the 8th century. In the 1st century, a Roman named Ovid translated them for Romans. So because of that, because they were originally collected by a Greek and then translated by a Roman, the mythology that we are most familiar with, Greek mythology, the gods have two names. But the importance, and I say this because a lot of times teachers turn this into a matching test for kids. They list the Greek gods on the left and the Roman gods on the right, and you have to match them. That's not what's important. The importance is in knowing the stories, because if you think back to Bettelheim, he really... No, not Bettelheim, Fry. Fry really talked about the importance of those archetypes. So myths are full of archetypes too. Here are a couple of collections of myths. On the left, you see Delaire's Book of Greek Myths. That's a big, oversized book, but it's full of all the Greek mythological stories. And then on the right, you see their collection, the same couple, their collection of Norse gods and giants. And then there's also books about Egyptian mythology. Many of you are familiar with the Percy Jackson series. Those were written by a man named Rick Riordan, who was a 7th grade English teacher at one point. And he really believed in the importance of kids becoming familiar with mythology. And so he's got the Percy Jackson series. Then he has a series about the Red Pyramid, that's Egyptian mythology. And he started a series about Norse myths. So he had some of the same beliefs that other scholars have had before him. Another subset of folk tales are what are called epics. Epics are long narrative poems that express the moral values of a society through the actions of a hero. You can see that right there on the PowerPoint. That's the definition. I don't spend a lot of time here in children's literature because those tend to be things that we read in high school or even college English. Some examples that you're probably very familiar with are the Odyssey and the Iliad. There's another one called Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh is actually believed to be the first story that was ever written. It was actually found chiseled in stone in Sumeria. So legends. Legends are another subset of folk tales, and they're a little bit different from myths in that they focus on humans without the intervention of the gods. Myths were all about show you right here. Myths were all about gods and goddesses and their interactions with us. And people wrote myths, more primitive people, as they were trying to explain things that they couldn't understand. So legends are kind of similar, except that there's no interaction between gods and humans. And the people are believed to have once lived on Earth. So some examples that you're familiar with are Robin Hood and King Arthur. And I want to just pause for a minute and say that Bible stories fit in here. They fit in here as a subset of folk tales. And the reason I want to mention Bible stories is that there's a Supreme Court ruling that's very important. You are allowed to use Bible stories in teaching as long as you are examining them as a piece of literature and not as a religious text. And the second stipulation is that you are also looking at literature from other religions. I would, if it were me, I would not use it in my classroom because of the risk of offending some or having complaints. But know that there is a Supreme Court ruling about that. Tall tales are another contribution or another subset of folk tales, and these are really America's contribution to folk tales. Tall tales were invented in America, and we made them popular. Stephen Kellogg is actually one of the best writers of tall tales for children. And when we think about tall tales, they tend to mostly be male figures. But there is a trend now toward creating tall tales that are about women. Some examples of tall tales are things like Paul Bunyan, Johnny Appleseed, Davy Crockett. There's one out now called Sally Ann, Thunder Ann, Whirlwind Crockett. It's about Davy Crockett's wife, Sally Ann. There's another one called Cut from the Same Cloth. It's all about women in tall tales. But what you need to remember about tall tales is that they are America's contribution to folk tales. Some trends with folk tales. Authors like to take a folk tale, update it, and put their own spin on it. So for example, the first one that came out was called Jim and the Beanstalk. It was a different spin on the classic folktale Jack and the Beanstalk. There are a lot of takes on Cinderella. I have one in my office called Cinder Edna. It's about the much more practical princess. The most popular are a series of books called The Jolly Postman, in which the authors, Janet and Alan Alberg, have taken a lot of folk tales and nursery rhymes and blended them together into a kind of a participation book. And then finally, the last thing I want to share with you is African American folk literature. There's lots of it out there. The best are by Virginia Hamilton. She has a couple of collections. One is The People Could Fly, and another is a collection called Her Stories. There's lots more out there. Ashley Bryan does a lot with African American folk literature, but know that it is out there and you want to make sure you include it.